Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today on the key to a successful cloud security strategy, with a specific focus on what every security and compliance team needs to consider. Thank you to those of you who are joining us on Zoom and those of you who are joining us via LinkedIn. Really great to have you with us, for us just to share some of our insights when it comes to security and compliance in the cloud. We've specifically chosen this topic today because for us as information security, information risk, and compliance professionals, we over the last few years have been really trying to understand how security and compliance needs to fit into this new world of the cloud. And so through our experience and having some practical implementation experience, we wanted to share some of these insights with all of you today. Before we get into the very exciting content that we have, I just want to kind of gauge everyone's sort of level of confidence around cloud security and compliance in the cloud. So are you feeling very confident? Are you feeling confident in your cloud security journey and what needs to be done from a security and compliance perspective? Are you a bit unsure, or are you totally lost? And if you're totally lost, it's good to have you here with us today, even if you're unsure. Hopefully by the end of today, you're feeling at that confident level. So please go ahead, submit your answers. Okay, well, it's good. I think we've got a couple of people feeling totally lost. Some pretty confident, but quite a few people who are feeling a bit unsure. So I think that's where we started out as well. And I think it's great then that you are here today, and hopefully by the end of today, you'll be feeling a lot more confident. So just to note that we are going to be running a few polls throughout today as well. The rest of the polls for today will reveal the results at the end during our Q&A session. So please, I encourage you just to answer the polls. Also, just a reminder that you can also post your questions as well. So just some instructions for today. We do have a chat box. So if any of you are struggling just in terms of any technical issues, please just post that into the chat box. And then we have the Q&A box where you can ask all your cloud security questions. Please, we really do encourage you to ask as many questions as you want. We really do want this to be our Q&A session at the end to be as interactive as possible. And then if you do want to send through your questions anonymously, there is the option that you can select as shown on the screen. You can just select the send anonymously tick box. Okay, and then, yeah, before we actually get into the crux of today, just a little bit of an intro into who I am. So my name is Amanda Hechter. I am a senior managing consultant at Mobius Consulting. I have 12 years of experience in information governance, risk, and security. And in the last 7 years, really just focused in the consulting space of those 12 years. And I hold the certifications of ISO Lead Implementer, Lead Auditor, and SSCP as well. And joining me today, we are very honored to have Sven Mueller with us. There he is on the screen. Hi, Sven. Really great to have Sven with us. And he's going to be sharing all of his insights and his practical experience. So Sven is a senior consultant. He's got 4 years of experience in IT and information security risk, and really over the last 2 years has been specifically focused on security in the cloud, compliance in the cloud, figuring out how do we do this in this new environment compared to traditional IT environments. Sven holds his certified cloud security professional, ISO 27001, as well as ITIL, as well as his AWS certified cloud practitioner. So it's really great to have Sven with us. I'm sure you're all going to find the content today very insightful, very useful. And again, just a reminder, please just post your questions in the Q&A as well. I'm going to hand over to Sven. All yours, Sven.
Thank you, Amanda. And I'd like to thank each and every one of you for joining us today on this webinar. I am feeling very honored to be sitting here and being able to present to you some hot and interesting topics that we found are absolutely necessary when organizations are adjourning to the cloud. So with no further ado, I'd like to dive into the topics I'll be discussing today. Firstly, we'll be talking about organizational readiness and how important this is for organizations to consider when migrating to the cloud. Next, I'll be unpacking the shared responsibility model with you guys. This is a model that looks very pretty on the surface and is usually represented in the form of a diagram. But what we found is that in practice, when implementing the shared responsibility model, that it actually proves to be very complicated. So I look forward to sharing some key insights on that with you. Then next, the third topic will be how you guys should be considering a more automated approach when it comes to evaluating and securing your cloud environment in comparison to traditional on-premise setups. And then lastly, I'll just briefly be touching on 3 specific technologies that we've identified that really are emerging as the hot technologies to have when migrating to the cloud, because at the end of the day, cloud security does require a layered defense approach when it comes to securing your cloud environment, as well as your workloads and data that you're hosting in this cloud environment. So the first topic is organizational readiness. And I think here, I think it's very well known that moving to the cloud can carry multiple business benefits, and how cloud technology really is at the center of this digital transformation revolution. Organizations are reaping benefits from increased performance and scalability, to being able to reduce their costs, and even being able to generate more business value now that they're able to tap into cutting-edge technologies such as artificial intelligence and machine learning, which previously may have not been viable. So as a result of this, it's really no surprise to us why organizations are being very quick to make the jump to the cloud. But in our experience, what organizations are failing to do is to adequately prepare themselves when moving to the cloud, and are not fully considering the impact that a move to the cloud can have on its people and culture, as well as on your processes and your technologies. So to make this easier to explain, we've broken this down into 3 streams, as you can see on the presentation. So we'll first be talking about the people stream and key steps that organizations should consider to adequately address this stream. Next up, I'll be talking a bit about the process stream, and lastly about the technology stream. So when it comes to the people stream, in my experience, this really has been the biggest challenge for organizations moving to the cloud, because your people are simply not ready for such a drastic digital transformation, and as a result are often the bottleneck to this process. And so to overcome this challenge, organizations need to acknowledge that a move to the cloud will require a big cultural change and a big shift in your mindset of your employees. So to aid in this, organizations really should look into nominating their IT leadership to act as change ambassadors. These change ambassadors will then have the responsibility to absolutely clearly communicate the benefits that this change is going to bring about in the organization, as well as to ensure that your employees are involved from early on in the process, so that any legitimate concerns can be recognized and be addressed up front. This type of transparency and honesty with in your organization will in turn foster trust and also result in a much more innovative and collaborative culture. Next up, what organizations should also really be considering when moving to the cloud is to implement formal training programs. So this is really a program where employees are afforded the opportunity and are incentivized to upskill themselves in this new landscape that they'll be finding themselves in. Another very common thing that organizations do is that they partner with a managed service provider or a migration partner. And these partners can then alleviate you as the cloud customer from common IT operational and security responsibilities, while your application and development teams are able to familiarize themselves with their new infrastructure as well as their day-to-day operations. Then the last point I want to mention about related to the people stream, and probably one of the most effective, in my view, is the establishment of a cloud center of excellence, who will be responsible for leading the organization through this transformational change. The cloud center of excellence is typically responsible for collecting hands-on experience in the cloud environment and returning this knowledge back into the business in the form of knowledge material, as well as instilling best practices. And so this in turn will also increase confidence within your organization, because the Cloud Center of Excellence, they are ultimately treating the cloud really as their product and your application and development teams as their customers. Next, we've got the process stream. And this stream is also really so important for organizations to consider, because this is the stream that really sets the foundation and provides direction on how things are going to operate in the cloud going forward. So when moving to the cloud, organizations are going to have to go through the monumental task of revising all of their, at least, doing kind of the preemptive view on whether your existing standards, processes, and procedures need to be revised so that they are still relevant for your cloud environment as well as fit for purpose. In our personal experience, when it comes to standards, here they can either be very principle-based or prescriptive-based. If they are very principle-based, your standards are then also typically technology agnostic and will most likely be 80 to 90% relevant for the cloud environment. And so there's much less work required here than if your standards are worded to be in a much more prescriptive manner. Where most of the notable work takes place is when it comes to your processes. And these processes can range from your IT processes, such as your change management process or your backup strategy, to your security processes. So this could be your security incident management process or your vulnerability management process. And even your compliance processes need to be relooked at to see if they are still relevant and fit for purpose for the cloud. So really, how is compliance monitoring and evaluation going to take place in the cloud, and how is this going to be reported on and fed back into the business? And so here, I really just want to highlight that organizations should not ignore this stream and should absolutely pour a lot of time and energy into this, because it really is so important, as it really does set the foundation and provide the direction on how things in the cloud are going to work going forward. So here, organizations need to be ready for lots and lots of procedures and new processes, lots of knowledge material, and a lot of collaboration between teams. Lastly, still speaking to organizational readiness, we've got the technology stream. So this is really where organizations need to be focusing on selecting the right security technologies when moving to the cloud, and also to ensure that they are getting maximum realization from their technologies. So two big considerations that we've identified here that organizations need to consider when moving to the cloud is that, firstly, a lot of your existing security technology will only exert a limited functionality in your cloud environment or may not be supported at all in your cloud environment. Then another big consideration that you would need to consider is that your cloud providers that to whom you now are migrating to very often also offer a cloud native equivalent of your security technology, and that will meet either the same objective or reduce the same risk as a technology that you may already have on premise. So this really puts us in a difficult situation where we need to make some technology decisions to ensure that we have the right technology in the cloud environment, and really that we are getting the maximum benefit of this technology. So a common approach that organizations can take here is to conduct a technology capability gap assessment. So this would really involve cataloging all of your existing on-premise security technologies that you may have. Then your next step would be to analyze all of these existing technologies and to determine whether they will be supported in your cloud environment or only exert a specific or limited functionality. And here you can already then determine which technologies will not be moved across or which technologies need to be considered for replacement. And this brings us to our next step in the gap assessment, which would be to identify if your cloud provider is offering a cloud native technologies that meet the same objective or reduce the same risk. And so once you've got this mapped out, it's quite easy then to conduct a capability assessment against these technologies in order for you to make the right technology decision when moving to the cloud. And so while this might seem as a tedious task, what I do want to highlight is that organizations should also really consider this as an opportunity to actually rationalize on your existing vendors and technologies, and perhaps also simplify your estate. Before I move on to my next section of this webinar, I just want to remind you guys to please, if you've got any questions, please post these in the Q&A section in the chat, and that we'll be addressing these later on in the webinar. So the next section I'll be talking about is the shared responsibility model. As I've mentioned previously, this model seems quite simple on the surface and is usually represented in the form of a very pretty picture, but in actual fact is quite complicated when it comes to implementing this shared responsibility model and really understanding it to ensure that you are meeting your security requirements and compliance requirements when moving to the cloud. So just in its most basic form, the shared responsibility model really is a new IT operating model that organizations experience when moving to the cloud, and then compared to a traditional on-premise environment where there was an IT team that was typically, or internal teams that were typically responsible for the full stack of your IT environment. Whereas now when you're moving to the cloud, you're outsourcing some of this responsibility to the cloud provider. And so the cloud provider now takes on a share of this responsibility in managing your IT environment. So what this means for us as security and compliance professionals is that cloud security is inherently a shared task between us as the cloud customer and the cloud service provider. And this is essential for organizations to grasp because from a security perspective, if you are unsure or unaware of your division of security responsibilities, this really is opening up the opportunity that you are missing some important security controls or not addressing vulnerabilities. And then this can result in the unfortunate event of a cyber attack or adversaries trying to exploit vulnerabilities that are left untreated. Then also from a compliance perspective, this model is also really important to understand because time and time again, what I've experienced is that organizations have a common misconception that just because they're consuming a cloud service in their cloud environment that is perhaps audited and certified against PCI DSS, that the cloud customer now automatically assumes that they are PCI DSS compliant. And that's really not the case. Before you can consider yourself PCI DSS compliant, you really need to determine where your share of responsibility lies, and then to ensure that that share is met with the requirements of PCI DSS before you can consider yourself PCI DSS compliant. So it really isn't a matter about how secure the cloud is these days, and the cloud providers are really putting in a lot of investment and undergoing annual audits. In fact, they've got all the kind of audits that you can find under the sun. And so it really isn't a matter of how secure the cloud is, but it really comes down to how securely you are operating in the cloud. This is also why Gartner predicts that by the year 2025, that 99% of all cloud breaches will most likely be at the customer's fault, whereas the cloud provider would have maintained their share of responsibility. So now that we have a brief understanding or a basic understanding of the shared responsibility model and why it is so important for security and compliance teams to understand, why is it still so complex to implement in an organization? So in reality, there's no one-size-fits-all solution. It's also not black and white. Organizations are consuming multiple cloud services at once, and each of these cloud services manifest in a different service model where there is a shift in responsibility between you as the customer and the cloud provider. Then another reason why the shared responsibility model is so much more complex in practice is because some organizations are not just adopting one cloud platform, they're actually adopting a multi-cloud or hybrid cloud deployment model. And so you're living in a world where you are presented with two shared responsibility models and two agreements with your cloud service providers. And each of these providers, excuse me, could be offering differing levels of security services, which further complicates the shared responsibility model. What we found is organizations also partner with a managed service provider. And so now we are not just in an agreement between two parties, which is the cloud customer and the cloud service provider. We actually found ourselves in an agreement between three parties, each party taking on a share of responsibility, which again further complicates the shared responsibility model. And then lastly, applications in the cloud are also typically deployed in a multi-tier fashion. So we've got multi-tier applications in the cloud where there could be a scenario such as an infrastructure team being responsible for backup management. And then you've got an application and development team that are responsible for the application. And so within your teams, you also exert a type of responsibility or RACI model. And if these are not clearly defined, then your internal teams can also be coming up with assumptions that this is being handled by another team. And this also further complicates the shared responsibility model. So now that we know why it's quite complicated to implement, I'd like to share with you some practical steps that security and compliance teams can take to ensure that they have themselves covered and are very clear on where their share of responsibility lies when it comes to consuming cloud services. So firstly, organizations need to determine their internal and external security and compliance requirements against applicable industry or regulatory framework that you need to conform to. Next, it's very important to have a visibility of and to understand what cloud services your organization is using or what cloud services your organization is planning to use. So once you're clear on exactly what your security and compliance requirements are, based off the standards that you need to conform to, as well as what cloud services are being used in your environment, you're now in a very good position to conduct risk assessments on these cloud services. And with the cloud service providers, they offer these compliance and trust portals where cloud customers can access the third-party attestation audit reports that are done on an annual basis with every kind of compliance framework under the sun. And so when you're assessing your cloud services against your applicable framework, this will bring about exactly what security controls you actually inherit as the cloud customer by the cloud service provider, and then what controls you are actually still responsible for to ensure compliance with that standard. And so if you are very clear, which this exercise does, on what your security requirements are and have this knowledge, then based on that, you should be defining and establishing a cloud security secure configuration standard. So this standard will then be exactly be stipulating and prescribing what your security requirements are when it comes to provisioning and securing cloud services in your cloud environment. I do just want to mention here that security requirements should not be defined in isolation, and that close collaboration should take place with your cloud security engineers as well as your cloud architects, so that you can ensure that these security requirements can actually be implemented in your cloud environment. And so once you've got your cloud security secure configuration standard, this then needs to be published and communicated widely throughout your organization. And there's obviously different ways to do this. Perhaps there's a formal onboarding process into the cloud where this standard is kind of made clear and people are educated on this standard or sign it off. But ultimately, you really do want to be trying to make security everyone's business in the cloud environment. And that's just due to a cloud security really following this kind of shared responsibility model. And so security really is everyone's responsibility in the cloud. Okay, that brings me to the end of my first section. We've got a poll here. As Amanda said, yeah, please answer. We'd love to get a feel on whether you found this shared responsibility model quite challenging, and that we'll be answering these in the Q&A section later on in the webinar. So please go ahead and pick your response. Okay, this brings me to the next section. And this section is really about why organizations, or rather security and compliance teams, really need to be considering a more automated approach when it comes to evaluating security posture and compliance in your cloud environment. And to explain this, we firstly need to understand that in the cloud, things work differently. Organizations really are trying to capitalize on the on-demand self-service capabilities that the cloud has to offer. And in parallel to this, organizations really are trying to adopt new IT modernization techniques, such as DevOps, as well as infrastructure as code. And so in the cloud, things move much faster because developers are granted much more autonomy to rapidly provision and deprovision infrastructure in your cloud environment than when compared to an on-premise setup where things took maybe 2 to 4 weeks to procure. Things in the cloud can now be spun up within 2 minutes. So the bottom line here is that in the cloud, things are moving at a much more rapid pace. And so if security and compliance teams are still following their traditional risk management methodologies, that this will most likely inhibit the business from adopting the cloud, because these produce rigid controls and are actually not scalable for the cloud. So security and compliance teams will be seen as a bottleneck to the business, rather than trying to make security an enabler of the business. So here, the speed of governance is absolutely important if organizations wish to leverage the true on-demand self-service scalability and performance benefits that the cloud has to offer. So here I just want to compare, I've got a pretty diagram here. So this really is comparing your traditional risk management methodologies versus an approach that follows a much more automated approach. Here we do understand that the automated approach is facilitated through the use of technology, and I'll be touching on this just down the line in my slide pack. But when we look on the traditional side of kind of manual assessments, these are very often done in a sampled approach and also point in time. So this already loses credibility because in the cloud, things are changing all the time. So a point in time assessment that was conducted in 2 weeks' time can potentially be considered inaccurate or outdated. Then also to the traditional process, these are also typically very time consuming and require a lot and back and forth with business stakeholders, and are also prone to human error. In addition to that, the respondents of these assessments, they can also interpret the questions perhaps a bit differently to how we wanted them to be answered. And so this can also result in inaccurate evidence collection. So when we compare this traditional method to a more automated approach, here we can very quickly see how the benefits are coming through. So with a more automated approach, we can assess the entire infrastructure. Not only can we assess our entire infrastructure in the cloud environment, we can also do this on a continuous basis. So as and when a configuration change in the cloud environment occurs, we will kick off an evaluation and see if this configuration change actually complies with our security and compliance requirements. And this is done through policy as code. This is also commonly referred to as compliance as code. And these are essentially just rules in your environment that are assessing the actual configuration of your resources versus your desired configuration of your resources. And if there's a mismatch, then that is considered a misconfiguration or a non-compliant event. With automated compliance, we also have the ability to get a view of our compliance almost in near real time and in the form of dashboards. So this is also a big benefit. And these compliance dashboards can also be used as an input, or most likely as a primary input into audits, which also saves us a lot of time and money. So when embarking on an automated compliance framework, I just want to talk about some practical lessons learned that I at least personally have learned through going through this journey. So before getting in a technology that can perform this function, and here the cloud providers, again, they offer a cloud native equivalent, or this could be a third-party technology. But before actually adopting a technology like this, it's highly recommended that the organization is very clear on what their security and compliance requirements are. And this almost brings me back to the approach I was describing when I was speaking about the shared responsibility model, just to be very clear on what your security and compliance requirements are, because this will be used as a primary input. And when procuring a technology like this, you'll be configuring that technology according to the standard. So it's really important for organizations to know what good looks like in their cloud environment, and that this standard can then be used as an input to evaluate yourselves against these requirements. Next, another important consideration for compliance and security teams is to determine what your alerting process will look like. So what happens if your technology does identify a non-compliant event or misconfiguration? Will you be alerting a central security team, or does it make more sense to alert the application team? This really is based on what the organization feels is best. If this goes to a security team, the security team will most likely review this non-compliant event and then approach the application team to remediate the misconfiguration. But at the same time, if you are notifying your application teams as and when a non-compliant event occurs, that this can also help in increasing the awareness throughout the organization on your cloud security requirements. And here I've just noted also, please consider using email groups. So this would be an email group that an application development team is a part of, and to avoid using individual email addresses, because as we know, people move on. And also this would help, using email groups would help increasing awareness of your security requirements throughout the organization. And lastly, another lesson learned is this automated technology also has or gives us the option of implementing security guardrails within our cloud environment. So these guardrails have the option to either prevent certain activities from occurring, or to automatically remediate a non-compliant event. So it's either kind of an explicit deny or an auto correction. But either way, these are commonly referred to as preventative guardrails. And here I just really want to highlight, and this is based on learnings, that organizations really should be undergoing this exercise more towards the start of their cloud journey, and before you've moved your critical production workloads into the cloud, to really identify which of these security requirements do you deem as high risk and absolutely non-negotiables, and then implementing these as preventative guardrails. And the reason for this is, if you're implementing these once you've already got operational workloads and production workloads in your environment, that you now have to consider business impact, versus if you've implemented these from the start, that these rather serve as a state management and that no impact will be occurred to the business. Cool, that brings me to the end of that section. I hope you guys have really been finding this information useful. To wrap off this section, we've got another poll where I'd love to hear on whether you guys have considered security and compliance automation as part of your cloud journey, or whether you are still following traditional risk management methodologies. Right, guys, yeah, that brings me to my last section. Again, I'll be asking to direct your attention to the diagram on the slide deck. But this section is really about what we've seen out there at our clients. And these are really just 3 technologies that are emerging as the future of cloud security. As we know, cloud security requires a layered defense approach. So we need to be ensuring that our cloud environment is secure, as well as the workloads hosted in our cloud environment. And as such, this has borne the need for these 3 technologies that I'll be briefly explaining and what purpose they serve. So firstly, we've got the Cloud Access Security Broker. As we can see on the diagram, this technology spans across all service models. And this is because this type of technology is used to really give organizations that holistic view of what cloud services your organization is consuming. So this isn't just confined to the cloud services that you are consuming within your public cloud environment, such as AWS or Azure. And this really gives the organization the holistic overview of what cloud services your organization is using. So this could be your marketing department using WeTransfer downstairs, and something like a CASB would pick this up. And perhaps your organization has classified this not as an enterprise approved solution. And based on this, the CASB will allow you to implement certain controls, such as preventing the use of this application, or perhaps only allowing the use of this application if your employees are using a managed device. So yeah, the Cloud Access Security Broker really gives you a holistic overview of what cloud services your organization is using. This gives organizations the ability to identify shadow IT. And these CASBs also come with functionality that actually automatically assess these cloud services and kind of give you a cloud confidence index on your kind of cloud service security posture. And then next, just going a layer deeper, another technology that is really relevant for the cloud is a technology called the Cloud Security Posture Management Solution. So this is actually where automated compliance comes into play. This is the technology that enables automated compliance. So this technology sits within your cloud environment and continuously evaluates your cloud environment and your cloud services against security best practices, against a standard or the vendor recommended best practices. So this is really the technology that enables compliance and security teams to automate their risk assessments in the cloud. Then we even go a layer deeper. This is the Cloud Workload Protection Platform. And why this technology is important is because in the cloud, organizations are adopting IT modernization techniques where applications are now hosted as serverless functions would be an example. Another example would be applications that are containerized and hosted in containers. So these are commonly referred to as serverless applications, and our traditional agent-based security solutions do not support this new type of technology. And this is where the Cloud Workload Protection Platform comes into play, in that this can actually scan your functions as code, as well as your containers, your runtime environments, against vulnerabilities and best practice configurations. So this kind of replaces your traditional agent-based vulnerability management solution. And this is what the vulnerability management solution has evolved into. These workload protection platforms typically also come with an agent-based option also, so that you can also secure your traditional virtual machines. And so we can see these technologies each serve a specific purpose. They by no means replace each other. They are actually supplementary of each other, because in the cloud, as I've explained, we really do need to look into a layered defense when it comes to cloud security. And that, folks, brings me to the end of my presentation. I really hope that you are able to take something with you today, and that you've learned something, and that you can apply this at your workplace. Yeah, again, thank you for giving me this opportunity to present on these key insights that we've acquired. Over to you, Amanda.
Thank you, Sven. Yeah, I think just for me, I mean, as much as we've been working together, I think just hearing some of the practicalities and what you've shared with us today, I think has given me even more insight into cloud security and compliance in the cloud, and just, yeah, some of the practical things that we can consider. But before we go into our Q&A, there were obviously a couple of polls that we ran through the webinar just to get some discussion going. So the first one being, what have you found most challenging when it comes to responsibilities in the cloud? And I think no surprise, most people, it has been that change in the cloud operating model versus traditional IT. And coming in second is being able to communicate those responsibilities clearly. So I think, Sven, just based on your experience in terms of traditional IT versus the new cloud operating model when it comes to sort of shared responsibilities, is there something that almost stands out for you in comparison? So what would be maybe like your key sort of recommendation to everyone today around when transitioning from that traditional IT and those responsibilities, moving those responsibilities into the cloud? Is there something specific that you would recommend to everyone today to consider as part of that journey?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm not surprised by that response. The cloud definitely takes on a different operating model. So in the cloud, we find ourselves in a much decentralized model. So we no longer have a central infrastructure team that is responsible for provisioning your infrastructure, as was the case with traditional on-premise setups. So in the cloud, we have a much decentralized model. And in my experience, to navigate around this, or to make these responsibilities more clear, is that this actually requires a lot of collaboration between the internal teams. And you've got your application and development teams, you've got your solution architects, you've got your security engineers. And what we found that really helps is the collaboration between these teams, which will really help unpack that kind of shared responsibility model. So, I mean, the last thing we want is that organizations or teams are assuming that this specific function is being handled by another team, because that really opens ourselves up to risk. And so collaborating between the teams is really important, and then documenting these in the form of RACI models is absolutely a key consideration to do here.
Awesome, thanks, Vince. And maybe just to add to that, I think, I mean, would you almost recommend or suggest that if you haven't quite understood internally those roles and responsibilities, even in the traditional sense, that's probably a good place to start, is really to understand those roles and responsibilities before you even start considering how that translates into the cloud.
Yes, I mean, even within the internal team, responsibilities are changing. I mean, as I've already said, in a traditional setup, your infrastructure team is really responsible for the provisioning of infrastructure. In the cloud, and they may no longer be provisioning infrastructure. They might just be defining those best practice blueprints, your infrastructure as code templates that application teams can then take to implement that infrastructure. So even within the internal teams, your tasks and responsibilities are changing. So I guess to your point, Amanda, yes, it's very important for the internal teams to look at what their world looks like in this new environment and what their responsibilities actually are and how they fit into this new world.
Awesome. Thanks, Sven. So the next poll, have you considered compliance and security automation as part of your cloud journey? So I think that's really, the stats are really awesome to see. We've got 57% of you saying somewhat and 38% of you saying yes. And I think, Sven, you'll be very happy to hear that because I know you're very passionate about automated compliance, automated security. So I think maybe just for the guys that are, sort of in that somewhat, the 57% that are in that somewhat, considering security automation and compliance automation, I suppose. Maybe for those in that 57%, what would kind of, it's maybe that they're on the fence a little bit. They're not too sure whether to go down that route or how to go down that route. And maybe, again, just based on your experience, maybe you went through that as well, where you're feeling a little bit unsure around, what it means. Do we go down that route? How do we go down that route? So if you think back to where you were at the start of your journey in getting this right, what would be a sort of a recommendation that you would give to the audience today?
So, hopefully today's presentation has, made it clear that there is an absolute need for a more automated approach. Really, if, security and compliance teams are still following Excel-based spreadsheet-driven risk assessments that are very manual and time-consuming, they really are not scalable for the cloud environment. Especially organizations adopting, multiple account strategies. And with all these workloads undergoing changes all the time, it's virtually impossible to be conducting assessments that take on a more manual approach. We've highlighted kind of the efficiencies around this. And so the need for a more automated approach really becomes imperative for the cloud environment. Again, here, my first recommendation for organizations going down this path is really to first be clear exactly what your cloud security requirements are, and then to consider the technology. In my eyes, the technology is the easy part, and that can be typically switched on, with the flip of a switch these days. And what it really comes down to is the process. So, really, what are your cloud security requirements? And what do you need to, which industry and regulatory frameworks do you need to conform to? And then based on that, you define your cloud security requirements. And then the tech is kind of the easy part that gets switched on, and you configure that tooling accordingly. Obviously, there's the option of going cloud native versus a third party. And both of those carry their pros and cons. So with a more cloud native approach, you probably do need more hands-on experience in the cloud environments and more technical skills to be able to configure a automated framework. Whereas a third-party technology, that's why we're going third parties, because the third party kind of handles this all for you.
Awesome. Thank you, Sven. I think that's really, really, really insightful. I think the key thing for me there is just, I think, in terms of the technology. So obviously we can't go down this route without understanding the technology, understanding the capabilities. So on top of, really knowing what your security requirements are, what your compliance requirements are, really getting a sense of what these various cloud solutions actually offer, and do they really meet those requirements that you've defined as well, to make the most informed decision when you go down that route. All right, awesome. So that brings us to our Q&A. So we've got some questions that have come through. Thank you to all of you that have posted some of your questions. If there are more questions, please continue to post while we're running through the existing questions that we've got. So I'm going to kick off with Matimba. So Matimba has a question for us, Sven. Please assist with the DR capability and if testing is required. So I'm assuming this is obviously in the cloud, given that most likely the DR capability is handled by the cloud service provider. Would testing still be required? Just based on your experience, is this something that you've been exposed to, and would you agree that testing would be required from a DR perspective?
Again, so I think there's not a one size fits all answer, because it actually really comes down to what cloud service you're consuming. And so that what cloud service you're consuming, because that cloud service could have a service model where the cloud provider actually takes on that responsibility model. And so that typically takes place from platform as a service upwards. So if you're adopting a cloud service that is considered infrastructure as code, and where you are kind of responsible for the operating system, then I would say yes, you are responsible for conducting a DR exercise, and that it's absolutely necessary. Whether if you are consuming a service that is considered to be more of a software as a service or a platform as a service, that the necessity to test your DR doesn't become as important, because here the cloud provider handles that for you. So I think my first answer to that, Amanda, is really first to determine what service model you're dealing with here, and to determine where the line of responsibility ends. And if the responsibility is within your line, then absolutely yes, DR needs to be tested.
Awesome. Makes a lot of sense. Thank you, Sven. Thank you, Matimba, for your question. All right, then we've got another one from Keshav. So this is more around the shared responsibility model. So who is responsible for shared control? So a nice example that Keshav has given is, for example, patch management. Is it the cloud provider that's responsible for the patching of their own infrastructure, and are customers then responsible for patching their own application?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And yeah, again, this typically is the case when it comes to IT operational processes in the cloud, specifically your backup management processes and something like your patch management process. So again, it depends on what cloud service model you are consuming. If you are doing infrastructure as a service, as in hosting your own virtual machines, then absolutely you as the cloud customer are responsible for patching your operating system and anything you host on top of that operating system. Whereas if you're consuming more of a SaaS service or a platform as a service, here the cloud customer takes on responsibility for patching, but there is a window where, as Keshav actually mentioned in his question, that there's a shared control. So the cloud provider will claim that they will patch your database, let's call this database being a platform as a service, and that they will patch your database, but it requires the cloud customer to actually opt into that and also define a maintenance window. And then the cloud provider will patch your database instance for you. And then you as the cloud customer, however, are still responsible for ensuring that your application is still functioning as intended. So that is where shared controls exist, where patch management would still be handled by the cloud provider and they will execute on the patching, but that there is typically an opt-in method or an opt-out method. And so just because they say they handle patch management for you doesn't actually mean that the patching is taking place, because there's a shared responsibility here where you as the application or the system owner actually need to agree to this and then opt in. And then this is typically done, in the form of, say, a backup tag that you then set to true. And in that tag, you can also set your maintenance window, and then the cloud provider will patch your instance for you. But again, when it comes to more of an infrastructure as a service type service model, then you as the cloud customer are responsible for patching your software.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Sven. I think, yeah, so it really, I mean, it sounds like just how you're explaining the shared responsibility model earlier in terms of its complexity, again, really depending on the service model that you are you making use of from that cloud service provider. That's the one thing to start off with, is really understand what that service model is, and what services are actually covered as part of that model. And I think it's also safe to say that we can't always assume that those things are actually in place, or that tick box in the cloud platform has actually been selected. And this is where that shared responsibility model and really unpacking those roles and responsibilities becomes so important. Thank you, Kisha, for your question. All right. Then we've got one around, this is anonymous. So what is the best way to assess third-party SaaS providers? So I think probably linked to the automated compliance sort of angle and how we assess SaaS providers, Sven.
So again, I mean, this really depends on what your internal and external requirements are. And then based on this, you would go in and assess your SaaS provider. I know that this can be enabled through technology. So CASBs these days are becoming more and more intelligent and are able to assess your SaaS solutions on your behalf against, again, industry and regulatory frameworks that you can then fine tune according to your requirements. I mean, if you're an organization that operates in an industry where you are really just concerned about the availability of your systems and not so much concerned about the confidentiality of your data because you don't process that, then you are going to be fine-tuning your assessment really to be focusing on that availability domain and what controls that SaaS provider has in place to keep your SaaS solution operational and available, because that is essentially what your business depends on. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Sven. Okay, and then I think we're going to go to one more question. So linked to automated compliance, are some of the automation tools that you've maybe seen out there, Sven, open source? And this part is probably a little bit more difficult to answer. If not, how much do they cost? So maybe just the first part is, are there any open source tools that you've seen out there that can aid in that automation from a compliance and security perspective?
Yes, there are open source tools out there. These can be found on GitHub repositories. I wouldn't say that these actually bear a cost. I mean, they're open source and you are able to install these, on your CLI and able to do automated scans against your cloud environment. I think where you would be incurring costs when using these open source tooling is when you're scanning. So the cloud provider makes their APIs available. And that's how we are able to scan our cloud environments against best practices. So if you're scanning your resources as well as your data, this is where you'll be incurring most of your costs. I mean, the cloud provider will have their kind of pricing models, but yeah, that's kind of my understanding, is that you can find open source tools out there that are available. And that these wouldn't incur a charge, unless these obviously need to be hosted, say, on an EC2 instance in your cloud environment, then you will be bearing the cost of running that EC2 instance.
Sven, maybe just to kind of add to that question, in terms of those open source tools, and maybe you don't have too much experience or exposure to them, but if you do, is there comparatively a difference between obviously the paid tools versus the open source tools in terms of capabilities? Is that something one would need to consider, before kind of going down the open source route, if they're looking at it from a cost perspective?
So, I mean, I'll be honest with you, my experience really lies within the cloud native services that the cloud providers offer for automated compliance, as well as third-party technologies. I'm not too clued up with the open source technologies. I know that pen testers typically use these open source technologies to perform their automated scans as part of their pen tests, to uncover whether they can exploit any misconfigurations. I would say, I mean, my concern would be really the maintenance of these open source softwares and whether they and their capabilities. So before considering an open source software, I really would want to look into its capabilities and what kind of standards we can assess our cloud environment against, whether that open source technology also supports things such as alerting, as well as preventative guardrails, and before going down that route, because the alerting and the preventative guardrails carry a lot of power, where organizations really have the opportunity to improve their compliance without necessarily increasing cost or personnel. So I really would look into the capabilities of that open source technology before kind of, picking that technology as your automated compliance tech.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you, Sven. All right. Well, thank you to everyone for all your questions. I hope through the discussion with Sven and Sven's answers, it's really shed some light on your questions. And I think with that, we're going to wrap up for today. But I think just in closing, again, thank you to everybody for joining. Sven, thank you so much to you for sharing your knowledge and your experience. And I think we just really, really appreciate that. And on that note, we asked the poll at the start of the webinar around how confident you're feeling in your cloud security journey. So please go ahead and let us know how you're feeling at this point in time. Hopefully, if you were totally lost, you're feeling a bit more sure. So please go ahead, let us know how you're feeling at this point in time. Okay, nice. It looks like the dials have moved a bit. That's really great to see. I think that's definitely what we wanted to achieve today. It's great to see that we've got more confident security and compliance professionals out there from a cloud perspective. And I think just in closing, please do feel free to just reach out to us if you do have any other questions. And also just remember to follow us on LinkedIn, go and check out our website. And I think for Sven and I, more importantly, let us know if you've got any other questions. Please feel free to reach out to us. Sven, thank you again. I don't know if you want to say your last goodbyes.
No, just again, thank you for allowing me this opportunity. I definitely had fun today sharing this knowledge and insights. And I just really hope that most of you could relate to the content, and that a lot of you can take something back with you today. So thanks a lot.